Hello, my name is Corey Salisbury, and today I'll be giving a summary of the lesson I gave to the youth group and to the men's breakfast. So I began by asking them what was the worst way their trust had been betrayed. And I got a few responses, and we discussed how those acts were motivated through selfish ambition and self-desire. And I explained to them where that self-desire comes from through reading the story of the fall in Genesis. Obviously, Adam and Eve wanted to have that knowledge like God from the serpent, and so they ate the fruit, and they spiritually died. But at the end of that verse, you can see how God forgives them for those acts. Because not only does he not physically kill them, but he also gives them garments to go to earth with. And that's because God knows that bitterness is a poison that only harms its user, and that forgiveness is the only right route. And so obviously, these two things affected Jesus' time, and you can see it in Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. So at the beginning of this, Peter comes up to Jesus and asks him, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answers, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times." So I kind of gave an explanation as to how and why Jesus says this. And the fact is that Jesus does not literally mean 77 times, but he means that you should forgive your brother or sister an indefinite amount of times. So he continues on and says, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay everything back.' The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go." So you can see a few parallels here to the parable and kind of how us Christians behave when we sin against God. Obviously, the kingdom is heaven. The king is God. The other servants, people who repay their sins. And so it says here that he had a debt of 10,000 bags of gold. Again, it doesn't mean literally 10,000 bags, but it means that that sin is a debt that can never necessarily be repaid. And so at this, the king says, like, everything that he has and his family be sold until he can repay the debt. And the servant begs him to have more patience on him and to just forgive him. And so the king obviously does and lets him go. Like I said, God forgives and he knows it's the best route. So we continue on verse 28 where it says, "But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I'll pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt." So here it shows kind of how unforgiving Christians kind of act when someone else does them wrong. And it says here that he owes like 100 silver coins. It doesn't literally mean 100 silver coins, but it kind of just shows how little the debt is that the other person shows towards us when they do us wrong. When we do God wrong, it's a higher debt. And so in verse 31, it says, "When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all he owed. So at the end, it kind of shows the hypocrisy that the first servant showed towards the other servant, because his debt was huge, but yet he was forgiven for it. But the other servant's debt was only a fraction of that, and yet he showed so much bitterness toward him that he sent him to jail until he could pay back what he owed. And so this led to him, being sent to jail until he could pay back what he owed. And so at the end of this, Jesus says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." So at the men's breakfast, I didn't ask the youth group for this, but at the men's breakfast, I kind of challenged the men there to share this message with someone who did them wrong, or they could forgive someone else that they did wrong. And that's sort of where the lesson ended, and hopefully this word can affect how you live. And I want to say thank you for listening to this.